Chapter 21. Loiterers will be shot, then arrested, and shot again. Blitzen once told me that dwarves never left home without a parachute. Now I understood the wisdom in that. Hearthstone and I plummeted through the frigid air, me waving my arms and screaming, Hearth in a perfect swan dive with granite Blitzen tied to his back. Hearth glanced over at me reassuringly, as if to say, "Don't worry. The dwarf is bubble-wrapped." My only response was more incoherent screaming, because I didn't know the ASL for holy freaking ag. We punched through a cloud and everything changed. Our fall slowed. The air turned warm and sweet. The sunlight intensified, blinding me. We hit the ground. Well, sort of. My feet touched down on freshly mown grass and I bounced right off, feeling like I weighed about 20 pounds. I astronaut skipped across the lawn until I found my balance. I squinted through the searing sunlight, trying to get my bearings. Acres of landscaping, tall trees, a big house in the distance. Everything seemed haloed in fire. No matter which direction I turned, I felt as though a spotlight was shining straight in my face. Hearthstone grabbed my arm. He pressed something into my hands, a pair of dark sunglasses. I put them on and the stabbing pain in my eyes subsided. "Thanks," I muttered. "Is it this bright all the time?" Hearthstone frowned. I must have been slurring my words. He was having trouble reading my lips. I repeated the question in sign language. "Always bright," Hearth agreed. "You get used to it." He scanned our surroundings as if looking for threats. We'd landed on the front lawn of a big estate. Low stone walls hedged the property, a golf course-size expanse of well-kept flower beds and thin willowy trees that looked as if they'd been pulled upward by gravity as they grew. The house was a Tudor-style mansion with leaded glass windows and conical turrets. "Who lives here?" I signed to Hearth. "President of Alfheim?" "Just a family. The Makepeaces." He spelled out their name. "They must be important," I signed. Hearth shrugged. "Regular. Middle class." I laughed, then realized he wasn't joking. If this was a middle-class family in Alfheim, I didn't want to split a lunch tab with the 1%ers. "We should go," Hearth signed. "Makepeaces don't like me." He readjusted his scarf harness for Blitzen, who probably weighed no more than a regular backpack in Alfheim. Together we headed for the road. I have to admit, the lighter gravity made me feel, well, lighter. I bounded along, airing 5 feet with every step. I had to restrain myself from leaping farther. With my energy strength, if I wasn't careful, I might have found myself jumping over the rooftops of middle-class mansions. As far as I could tell, Alfheim was just row after row of estates like the Makepeaces, each property at least several acres, each lawn dotted with flower beds and topiaries. In the cobblestone driveways, black luxury SUVs gleamed. The air smelled like baked hibiscus and crisp dollar bills. Sam had said our flight path to Norwood would put us over the best drop zone. Now that made sense. In the same way Nidavellir resembled Sooty, Alfheim reminded me of the posh suburbs west of Boston. Wellesley, maybe, with its huge houses and pastoral landscapes, its winding roads, picturesque creeks, and sleepy aura of absolute safety, assuming you belonged there. On the downside, the sunlight was so harsh it accentuated every imperfection. Even one stray leaf or wilted flower in a garden stood out as a glaring problem. My own clothes looked dirtier. I could see every pore on the back of my hands and the veins under my skin. I also understood what Hearthstone meant about Alfheim being made of air and light. The whole place seemed unreal, like it was whisked together from cotton candy fibers and might dissolve with a splash of water. Walking across the spongy ground, I felt uneasy and impatient. The super dark sunglasses only did so much to alleviate my headache. After a few blocks, I signed to Hearthstone, "Where are we going?" He pursed his lips. "Home." I caught his arm and made him stop. "Your home?" I signed. "Where you grew up." Hearth stared at the nearest quaint garden wall. Unlike me, he wore no sunglasses. In the brilliant daylight, his eyes glittered like crystal formations. Skafnung Stone is at home, he signed. With, Father. The sign for father was an open hand, palm facing out, thumb across the forehead. It reminded me of L for loser. Given what I knew about Hearth's childhood, that seemed appropriate. Once, in Jotunheim, I'd done some healing magic on Hearth. I'd gotten a glimpse of the pain he carried around inside. He'd been mistreated and shamed while growing up, mostly because of his deafness. Then his brother had died. I didn't know the details, and his parents had blamed Hearth. He couldn't possibly want to go back to a home like that. I remembered how strongly Blitzen had protested the idea, even when he knew he was going to die. Don't make Hearth go. Not worth it, kid. Yet here we were. Why? I signed. Why would your father, loser, have the Skafnung Stone? Instead of answering, Hearthstone nodded in the direction we'd come. Everything was so bright in Elf World, I hadn't noticed the flashing lights until the sleek black town car pulled up directly behind us. Along the sedan's front grille, red and blue sequencers pulsed. Behind the windshield, two elves in business suits scowled at us. The Alfheim Police Department had come to say hello. Can we help you? Asked the first cop. Right then, I knew we were in trouble. In my experience, no cop ever said can we help you if he had any actual desire to help. Another giveaway, cop number 1's hand was resting on the butt of his sidearm. Cop number 2 edged around the Passenger's side, also looking ready to break out some helpful deadly force. Both elves were dressed like plainclothes detectives in dark suits and silk ties, with ID badges clipped to their belts. Their short cropped hair was as blonde as Hearthstone's. They had the same sort of pale eyes and eerily calm expressions. Otherwise they looked nothing like my friend. The cops seemed taller, spindlier, more alien. They exuded a cold air of disdain, as though they had personal AC units installed under their shirt collars. The other thing I found strange, they spoke. I'd spent so much time around Hearthstone, who communicated in eloquent silence, that hearing an elf speak was really jarring. It just seemed wrong. Both cops focused on Hearthstone. They looked right through me as if I didn't exist. I asked you a question, pal, the first cop said. Is there a problem here? Hearthstone shook his head. He edged back, but I caught his arm. Retreating would only make things worse. We're good, I said. Thanks, officers. The detectives stared at me like I was from another world, which, to be fair, I was. The ID tag on cop number 1's belt read Sunspot. He didn't look much like a sunspot. Then again, I guessed I didn't look much like a chase. Cop number 2's ID read Wildflower. With a handle like that, I wanted him to be wearing a Hawaiian shirt or at least a floral pattern tie, but his outfit was just as boring as his partner's. Sunspot wrinkled his nose as if I smelled like a white sparrow. Where'd you learn Elfish, Thick? That accent is horrible. Thick? I asked. Wildflower smirked at his partner. What do you bet Elfish isn't his first language? Il legal Husviator would be my guess. I wanted to point out that I was a human speaking English, and it was my first language. Also my only language. Elfish and English just happened to be the same, like Hearth's Elf Sign Language was the same as American Sign Language. I doubted the cops would listen or care. The way they spoke was a little strange to my ears, a sort of old-fashioned, aristocratic American accent I'd heard on newsreels and movies from the 1930s. Look, guys, I said, we're just taking a walk. In a nice neighborhood, said Sunspot, where I'm guessing you don't live. The makepeaces down the road, they called in a report. Somebody trespassing, loitering. We take that sort of thing seriously, Thick. I had to tamp down my anger. As a homeless person, I'd been a frequent target for rough treatment by law enforcement. My darker-skinned friends got it even worse. So, during the 2 years I lived on the street, I'd learned a whole new level of caution when dealing with friendly neighborhood police officers. And yet, I didn't like being called a thick. Whatever that was. "Officers," I said, "we've been walking for maybe 5 minutes. We're heading to my friend's house. How is that loitering?" Hearthstone signed to me, "Careful." Sunspot frowned. "What was that? Some kind of gang sign?" "Speak Elfish." "He's deaf," I said. "Deaf?" Wildflower's face scrunched up in disgust. "What kind of elf?" "Whoa, partner." Sunspot swallowed. He tugged at his collar like his personal AC had stopped working. "Is that? That's gotta be, Mr. Alderman's kid." Wildflower's expression shifted from contempt to fear. It would have been kind of satisfying to watch, except that a fearful cop was way more dangerous than a disgusted one. "Mr. Hearthstone?" Wildflower asked. "Is that you?" Hearthstone nodded glumly. Sunspot cursed. "All right. Both of you, in the car." "Whoa, why?" I demanded. "If you're arresting us, I want to know the charges." "We're not arresting you, thick," Sunspot growled. "We're taking you to CMR. Alderman." After that, Wildflower added, "You won't be our problem anymore." His tone made it sound like we'd be no one's problem, since we'd be buried under a lovely well-tended flower bed somewhere. The last thing I wanted to do was get in the car, but the cops tapped their fingers on their elfish firearms, showing us just how helpful they were prepared to be. I climbed into the back of the cruiser. Chapter 22. Pretty sure Hearthstone's dad is a cow-abducting alien. It was the nicest cop car I'd ever been in, and I'd been in quite a few. The black leather interior smelled of vanilla. The plexiglass divider was squeaky clean. The bench seat had a massage feature so I could relax after a hard day of loitering. Obviously, they served only the finest criminals here in Alfheim. After a mile of comfortable cruising, we pulled off the main road and stopped at a pair of iron gates monogrammed with a fancy A. On either side, 10-foot-tall stone walls were topped with decorative spikes to keep out the upper-middle-class riffraff who lived down the street. From the tops of the gateposts, security cameras swiveled to study us. The gates opened. As we drove through into Hearthstone's family estate, my jaw nearly dropped off. I thought my family mansion was embarrassing. The front yard was bigger than the Boston Common. Swans glided across a lake edged with willow trees. We drove over 2 different bridges crossing a winding creek, past 4 different gardens, then through a second set of gates before coming to the main house, which looked like a postmodern version of Sleeping Beauty Castle at Disneyland. White and grey slab walls jutting out at strange angles, slender towers like organ pipes, huge plate glass windows, and a burnished steel front door so large it probably had to be opened by chain-pulling trolls. Hearthstone fidgeted with his bag of runes, occasionally glancing back toward the car's trunk, where the cops had stowed Blitzen. The officers said nothing until we parked at the front door. "Out," Wildflower said. As soon as Hearthstone was free, he walked to the back of the cruiser and rapped on the trunk. "Yeah, fine." Sunspot popped the lid. "Though I don't see why you care. That has to be the ugliest dwarf lawn ornament I've ever seen." Hearthstone gently lifted out Blitzen and slung the granite dwarf over his shoulder. Wildflower shoved me toward the entrance. "Move, thick." "Hey." I almost reached for my pendant but caught myself. At least the cops now treated Hearthstone as off-limits, but they still seemed perfectly fine pushing me around. "Whatever thick means," I said, "I'm not it." Wildflower snorted. "Have you looked in the mirror recently?" It dawned on me that, compared to elves, all willowy and delicate and handsome, I must have looked squat and clumsy thick. I got the feeling the term also implied mentally slow, because why insult someone on one level when you can insult them on 2? I was tempted to wreak my revenge on the police officers by bringing out Jack to sing some top 40 hits. Before I could, Hearthstone took my arm and led me up the front steps. The cops trailed behind us, putting distance between themselves and Hearthstone as if they feared his deafness might be contagious. When we reached the top step, the big steel door swung open silently. A young woman hurried out to meet us. She was almost as short as Blitzen, though she had blonde hair and delicate features like an elf. Judging from her plain linen dress and white hair bonnet, I assumed she was a house servant. Hearth. Her eyes lit up in excitement, but she quickly stifled her enthusiasm when she saw our police escorts. Mr. Hearthstone, I mean. Hearth blinked like he might start crying. He signed, "Hello/sorry," blending them together in a single word. Officer Wildflower cleared his throat. "Is your master home, Inga?" Oh, Inga gulped. She looked at Hearthstone, then back at the cops. "Yes, sir, but go get him," snapped Sunspot. Inga turned and fled inside. As she hurried away, I noticed something hanging from the back of her skirt, a cord of brown and white fur, frayed at the end like the tassel of a belt. Then the tassel flicked, and I realized it was a living appendage. "She's got a cow tail," I blurted. Sunspot laughed. "Well, she's a hoolder. It would be illegal for her to hide that tail. We'd have to bring her in on charges of impersonating a proper elf." The cop gave Hearthstone a quick look of distaste, making it clear that his definition of proper elf also did not include my friend. Wildflower grinned. "I don't think the boy has ever seen a hoolder before, Sunspot. What's the matter, Thick? They don't have domesticated forest sprites in whatever world you crawled out of." I didn't answer, though in my mind I was imagining Jack belting out Selena Gomez right in the policeman's ears. The thought comforted me. I stared into the foyer, a sunlit colonnade of white stone and glass skylights that still managed to make me feel claustrophobic. I wondered how Inga felt about being required to display her tail at all times. Was it a source of pride to show her identity, or did it feel like a punishment, a constant reminder of her lesser status? I decided the really horrible thing was entwining the two together. Show us who you are, now feel bad about it. Not much different from Hearth signing hello and sorry as a single word. I felt Mr. Alderman's presence before I saw him. The air turned cooler and carried a scent of spearmint. Hearthstone's shoulders slumped as if Midgard gravity were taking over. He shifted Blitzen to the middle of his back as if to hide him. The spots on Hearth's scarf seemed to swarm. Then I realized Hearth was shivering. Footsteps echoed on the marble floor. Mr. Alderman appeared, rounding one of the columns and marching toward us. All four of us stepped back, Hearth, me, even the cops. Mr. Alderman was almost 7 feet tall, and so thin that he looked like one of those UFO flying, strange medical experiment conducting aliens from Roswell. His eyes were too large. His fingers were too delicate. His jaw was so pointy I wondered if his face had been hung on a perfect isosceles triangle. He dressed better than your average UFO traveler, though. His gray suit fit perfectly over a green turtleneck that made his neck look even longer. His platinum blonde hair bristled like Hearth's. I could see some family resemblance in the nose and the mouth, but Mr. Alderman's face was much more expressive. He looked harsh, critical, dissatisfied, like someone who'd just had an outrageously expensive, terrible meal and was contemplating the 1-star review he was going to write. Well. His eyes dug into his son's face. "You're back. At least you had enough sense to bring the son of Frey with you." Sunspot choked on his own smug smile. "Sorry, sir." "Who?" "This lad." Mr. Alderman pointed to me. "Magnus Chase, son of Frey, isn't it?" "That's me." I bit back the urge to add sir. So far, this dude hadn't earned it. I wasn't used to people looking impressed when they found out my dad was Frey. Reactions normally ranged from "Gee, I'm sorry" to "Who is Frey?" to hysterical laughter. So I'm not going to lie. I appreciated how quickly the cop's expressions changed from contempt to "oh poop, we just dissed a demigod." I didn't understand it, but I liked it. We didn't know. Wildflower brushed a speck off my shirt like that would make everything better. Thank you, officers, Mr. Alderman cut in. I will take it from here. Sunspot gaped at me like he wanted to apologize, or possibly offer me a coupon for 50% off my next imprisonment. You heard the man, I said. Off you go, Officers Sunspot and Wildflower. And don't worry. I'll remember you. They bowed to me, actually bowed, then made a hasty retreat to their vehicle. Mr. Alderman scrutinized Hearthstone as if looking for visible defects. You're the same, he pronounced sourly. At least the dwarf has turned to stone. That's an improvement. Hearthstone clenched his jaw. He signed in short angry bursts, his name is Blitzen. Stop, Alderman demanded. None of that ridiculous hand-waving. Come inside. He gave me the sub-zero once-over. We must properly welcome our guest. Chapter 23. Yep, his other car is definitely a UFO. We were shown into the living room, where absolutely nothing was living. Light spilled in from huge picture windows. The 30-foot ceiling glittered with a silver mosaic of swirling clouds. The polished marble floor was blindingly white. Lining the walls, illuminated niches displayed various minor ALS, stones, and fossils. All around the room, yet more artifacts sat under glass cases on white podiums. As far as museums went, yet, great space. As far as rooms where I wanted to hang out, no thanks. The only places to sit were two long wooden benches on either side of a steel coffee table. Above the mantel of the cold fireplace, a giant oil portrait of a young boy smiled down at me. He didn't look like Hearthstone. His dead brother, Andiron, I guessed. The boy's white suit and beaming face made him look like an angel. I wondered if Hearthstone had ever looked that happy as a child. I doubted it. The smiling elf boy was the only joyful thing in this room, and the smiling elf boy was dead, frozen in time like the other artifacts. I was tempted to sit on the floor instead of the benches. I decided to try politeness. It hardly ever works for me, but once in a while I give it a shot. Hearthstone put Blitzen down carefully on the floor. Then he sat next to me. Mr. Alderman made himself uncomfortable on the bench across from us. Inga, he called, refreshments. The holder materialized in a nearby doorway. Right away, sir. She scurried off again, her cowtail swishing in the folds of her skirt. Mr. Alderman fixed Hearthstone with a withering stare, or maybe it was his normal "wow, I missed you" expression. Your room is as you left it. I assume you will be staying. Hearthstone shook his head. We need your help. Then we will leave. Use the slate, son. Mr. Alderman gestured at the end table next to Hearth, where a small whiteboard sat with a marker attached by a string. The old elf glanced at me. The slate encourages him to think before he speaks, if you can call that hand-waving speech. Hearthstone crossed his arms and glared at his father. I decided to play translator before one of them killed the other. Mr. Alderman, Hearth and I need your help. Our friend Blitzen has turned to stone, said Mr. Alderman. Yes, I can see that. Fresh running water will bring back a petrified dwarf. I don't see the issue. That information alone would have made the unpleasant trip to Alfheim worth it. I felt like the weight of a granite dwarf had been lifted from my shoulders. Unfortunately, we needed more. But see, I said, I turned Blitzen to stone on purpose. He was wounded by a sword. The Skofnung sword. Mr. Alderman's mouth twitched. Skofnung. Yet. Is that funny? Alderman showed his perfect white teeth. You've come here for my help. To heal this dwarf. You want the Skofnung stone. Yet. You have it. Oh, certainly. Mr. Alderman gestured to one of the nearby podiums. Under a glass case sat a stone disc about the size of a dessert plate, grey with blue flecks, just as Loki had described. "I collect artifacts from all the 9 worlds," said Mr. Alderman. "The Skofnung stone was one of my first acquisitions. It was specially enchanted to withstand the magical edge of the sword, to sharpen it if necessary, and, of course, to provide an instant remedy in the event some foolish wielder cut himself." "That's great," I said. "How do you heal with it?" Alderman chuckled. "Quite simple. You touch the stone to the wound, and the wound closes. So, can we borrow it?" "No." Why was I not surprised? Hearthstone gave me a look like, "Yes, 9 worlds best dad." Inga returned with 3 silver goblets on a tray. After serving Mr. Alderman, she set a cup in front of me, then she smiled at Hearthstone and gave him his. When their fingers touched, Inga's ears turned bright red. She hurried off back to wherever she was required to stay, out of sight but within shouting distance. The liquid in my cup looked like melted gold. I hadn't eaten or drunk anything since breakfast, so I'd been kind of hoping for elfish sandwiches and sparkling water. I wondered if I was supposed to ask about the goblet's creation and its famous deeds before I drank, the way I would in Nidavellir, the world of the dwarves. Something told me no. The dwarves treated every object they made as unique, deserving of a name. From what I'd seen so far, elves surrounded themselves with priceless artifacts and didn't care about them any more than they cared about their servants. I doubted they named their goblets. I took a sip. Without doubt, it was the best stuff I'd ever had, with the sweetness of honey, the richness of chocolate, and the coolness of glacier ice, yet it tasted unlike any of those. It filled my stomach more satisfyingly than a 3-course meal. It completely quenched my thirst. The jolt it gave me made the mead of Valhalla seem like a knockoff brand of energy drink. Suddenly, the living room was tinged with kaleidoscopic light. I gazed outside at the well-manicured lawn, the sculptured hedgerows, the garden topiaries. I wanted to pull off my sunglasses, break through the window, and go skipping merrily through Alfheim until the sun burned my eyes out. I realized Mr. Alderman was watching me, waiting to see how I handled the elfish goofy juice. I blinked several times to get my thoughts back in order. "Sir," I said, because politeness was working so well, "why won't you help us?" "I mean, the stone is right there." "I will not help you," said Mr. Alderman, "because it would serve me no purpose." He sipped his drink, raising his pinky finger to show off a glittering amethyst ring. "My son, Hearthstone, deserves no help from me. He left years ago without a word." He paused, then barked a laugh. "Without a word? Well, of course he did. But you take my meaning." I wanted to shove my goblet between his perfect teeth, but I restrained myself. "So Hearthstone left. Is that a crime?" "It should be." Alderman scowled. "In doing so, he killed his mother." Hearthstone choked and dropped his goblet. For a moment, the only sound was the cup rolling on the marble floor. "You didn't know?" Mr. Alderman asked. "Of course you didn't. Why would you care? After you left, she was distracted and upset. You have no idea how you embarrassed us by disappearing. There were rumors about you studying rune magic, of all things, consorting with Mimir and his riffraff, befriending a dwarf. Well, one afternoon, your mother was crossing the street in the village, on her way back from the country club. She had endured awful comments from her friends at lunch. She feared her reputation was ruined. She wasn't looking where she was going. When a delivery truck ran the red light." Alderman gazed at the mosaic ceiling. For a second, I could almost imagine he had emotions other than anger. I thought I detected sadness in his eyes. Then his gaze froze over with disapproval again. "As if causing your brother's death hadn't been bad enough." Hearthstone fumbled for his goblet. His fingers seemed to be made of clay. It took him 3 tries to stand the cup upright on the table. Spots of gold liquid made a trail across the back of his hand. Hearth. I touched his arm. I signed, "I'm here." I couldn't think of what else to say. I wanted him to know he wasn't alone, that someone in this room cared for him. I thought about the rune stone he'd showed me months ago, Perthrow, the sign of the empty cup, Hearth's favorite symbol. Hearthstone had been drained by his childhood. He'd chosen to fill his life with rune magic and a new family which included me. I wanted to yell at Mr. Alderman that Hearthstone was a better elf than his parents ever were. But one thing I'd learned from being a son of Frey: I couldn't always fight my friends' battles. The best I could do was be there to heal their injuries. Also, yelling at Mr. Alderman wouldn't get us what we needed. Sure, I could some Monday Jack, bust into the display case, and just take the stone. But I was betting Mr. Alderman had some first-rate security. It wouldn't do Blitzen any good to get healed only to be killed immediately by the Alfheim SWAT unit. I wasn't even sure the stone would work properly if it wasn't given freely by its owner. Magic items had weird rules, especially ones named Skofnung. Mr. Alderman. I tried to keep my voice even. What do you want? He raised a platinum blonde eyebrow. Excuse me. Aside from making your son feel miserable, I added. You're really good at that. But you said helping us wouldn't serve a purpose for you. What would make it worth your while? He smiled faintly. Ah, a young man who understands business. From you, Magnus Chase, I don't require much. You know the Vanir are our ancestral gods? Frey himself is our patron and lord. All of Alfheim was given to him as his teething gift when he was a child. So, he chewed on you and spit you out. Mr. Alderman's smile died. My point is that a son of Frey would make a worthy friend for our family. All I would ask is that you stay with us for a while, perhaps attend a small reception, just a few hundred close associates. Show yourself, take a few photos with me for the press. That sort of thing. The gold drink started to leave a bad AF taste in my mouth. Photos with Alderman sounded almost as painful as getting decapitated by a wire. You're worried about your reputation, I said. You're ashamed of your son, so you want me to bolster your street cred. Alderman's big alien eyes narrowed, making them almost normal size. I do not know this term street cred. But I believe we understand each other. Oh, I understand you. I glanced at Hearthstone for guidance, but he still looked unfocused, miserable. So, Mr. Alderman, I do your little photo op, and you give us the stone. Well, now. Alderman took a long sip from his goblet. I would expect something from my wayward son, as well. He has unfinished business here. He must atone. He must pay his wergild. What's a wergild? I silently prayed it wasn't like a werewolf. Hearthstone knows what I mean. Alderman stared at his son. Not a hair must show. You do what must be done, what you should have done years ago. While you work on that, your friend will be a guest in our house. Wait, I said. How long are we talking about? We've got somewhere important to be in, like, less than 4 days. Mr. Alderman bared his white teeth again. Well, then, Hearthstone had better hurry. He rose and shouted, Inga. The Hulder scurried over, a dish rag in her hands. Provide for my son and his guest as needed, said Mr. Alderman. They will stay in Hearthstone's old room. And Magnus Chase, do not think you can defy me. My house, my rules. Try to take the stone and, son of Frey or not, it won't go well for you. He tossed his goblet on the floor, as if he couldn't allow Hearthstone to have the most impressive spill. Clean that up, he snapped at Inga. Then he stormed out of the room. Chapter 24. Oh, you wanted to breathe? That'll be an extra 3 gold. Hearthstone's room? More like Hearthstone's isolation chamber. After cleaning up the spill, we insisted on helping. Inga led us up a wide staircase to the 2nd floor, down a hall bedecked with lush tapestries and more artifact niches, to a simple metal door. She opened it with a big old-fashioned key, though doing so made her wince as if the door was hot. "Apologies," she told us. "The house's locks are all made of iron. They're uncomfortable for sprites like me." Judging from the clammy look on her face, I think she meant torturous. I guessed Mr. Alderman didn't want Inga unlocking too many doors, or maybe he just didn't care if she suffered. Inside, the room was almost as large as my suite in Valhalla, but whereas my suite was designed to be everything I could want, this place was designed to be nothing Hearthstone would want. Unlike every other part of the house I'd seen, there were no windows. Rows of fluorescent lights glowed harshly overhead, providing all the ambience of a discount furniture store. On the floor in one corner lay a twin mattress covered in white sheets. No blanket, no comforter, no pillows. To the left, a doorway led to what I assumed was the bathroom. To the right, a closet stood open, revealing exactly one set of clothes, a white suit roughly hearth size but otherwise an exact match for the suit in the portrait of Andiron downstairs. Mounted on the walls, classroom-size whiteboards displayed to-do lists written in neat block letters. Some lists were in black: your own laundry, twice weekly equals +2 gold, sweep the floors, both levels equals +2 gold, worthy tasks equals +5 gold. Others were in red: each meal equals 3 gold, 1 hour of free time equals 3 gold, embarrassing failures equals 10 gold. I counted maybe a dozen lists like this, along with hundreds of motivational statements like, "Never forget your responsibility. Strive to be worthy. Normalcy is the key to success." I felt as if I were surrounded by towering adults all wagging their fingers at me, heaping shame, making me smaller and smaller. And I'd only been here for a minute. I couldn't imagine living here. Even the 10 Commandments whiteboards weren't the strangest thing. Stretched across the floor was the furry blue hide of a large animal. Its head had been removed, but its forepaws still had the claws attached, curved ivory barbs that would have made perfect fishing hooks for catching great white sharks. Strewn across the rug were gold coins, maybe 200 or 300 of them, glittering like islands in a sea of thick blue fur. Hearthstone set Blitzen down gently at the foot of the mattress. He scanned the whiteboards, his face a mask of anxiety, as if looking for his name on a list of exam scores. Hearth. I was so shocked by the room I couldn't form a coherent question like, "Why?" or, "May I please kick your father's teeth in?" He made one of the first signs he'd ever taught me back on the streets, when he was teaching me how to stay out of trouble with the police. He crossed 2 fingers and ran them down his opposite palm like he was writing a ticket: rules. It took a moment for my hands to remember how to sign. "Your parents made these for you?" "Rules," he repeated. His face gave away little. I started to wonder if, earlier in his life, Hearthstone had smiled more, cried more, shown any emotion more. Maybe he'd learned to be so careful with his expressions as a defense. "But why the prices?" I asked. "It's like a menu." I stared at the gold coins glittering on the fur rug. "Wait, the coins were your allowance? Or, your payment? Why throw them on the rug?" Inga stood quietly in the doorway, her face lowered. "It's the hide of the beast," she said, also signing the words. "The one that killed his brother." My mouth tasted like rust. "Andiron." Inga nodded. She glanced behind her, probably worried that the master would appear out of nowhere. It happened when Andiron was 7 and Hearthstone was 8. As she spoke, she signed almost as fluently as Hearth, like she'd been practicing for years. They were playing in the woods behind the house. "There's an old well." She hesitated, looking at Hearthstone for permission to say more. Hearthstone shuddered. Andiron loved the well, he signed. He thought it granted wishes. But there was a bad spirit. He made a strange combination of signs: 3 fingers at the mouth, AW for water, then pointing down the symbol for a well, then a V over one eye, the sign for taking a pee. We used that one a lot on the streets, too. Together, it looked like he was naming this bad spirit peas in the well. I frowned at Inga. Did he just say? Yes, she confirmed. That is the spirit's name. In the old language, it is called a brun miji. It came out of the well and attacked Andirn in the form of, that. A large bluish creature, a mixture of bear and wolf. Always with the blue wolves. I hated them. It killed Andirn, I summed up. In the fluorescent light, Hearthstone's face looked as petrified as Blitzen's. I was playing with some stones, he signed. My back was turned. I didn't hear. I couldn't. He grasped at empty air. It wasn't your fault, Hearth, Inga said. She looked so young with her clear blue eyes, her slightly pudgy rosy cheeks, her blonde hair curling around the edges of her bonnet, but she spoke as if she'd seen the attack firsthand. Were you there? I asked. She blushed even more. Not exactly. I was just a little girl, but my mother worked as Mr. Alderman's servant. I remember Hearthstone running into the house crying, signing for help. He and Mr. Alderman rushed out again. And then, later, Mr. Alderman came back, carrying Master Andirn's body. Her cowtail flicked, brushing the door jamb. Mr. Alderman killed the brun miji, but he made Hearthstone skin the creature, all by himself. Hearthstone wasn't allowed back inside until the job was done. Once the hide was cured and made into a rug, they put it in here. Gods! I paced the room. I tried to wipe some of the words off a whiteboard, but they were written in permanent marker. Of course they were. And the coins? I asked. The menu items. My voice came out harsher than I'd intended. Inga flinched. Hearthstone's were guild, she said. The blood debt for his brother's death. Cover the rug, Hearthstone signed mechanically, as if quoting something he'd heard a million times. Earn gold coins until not a single hair can be seen. Then I have paid. I looked at the list of prices, the pluses and minuses of Hearthstone's guild ledger. I stared at the sprinkling of coins lost in an expanse of blue fur. I imagined 8-year-old Hearthstone trying to earn enough money to cover even the smallest portion of this huge rug. I shivered, but I couldn't shake off my Nger Hearth. I thought your parents beat you or something. This is worse. Inga wrung her hands. Oh, no, sir, beatings are only for the house staff. But you are right. Mr. Hearthstone's punishment has been much more difficult. Beatings. Inga mentioned them as if they were unfortunate facts of life, like burned cookies or stopped-up sinks. I'm going to tear this place down, I decided. I'm going to throw your father. Hearthstone locked eyes with me. My Nger backwashed in my throat. This wasn't my call. This wasn't my history. Still. Hearth, we can't play his sick little game, I said. He wants you to complete this war guild before he helps us? That's impossible. Sam's supposed to marry a giant in 4 days. Can't we just take the stone? Travel to another world before Alderman realizes. Hearth shook his head. Stone must be a gift. Only works if given freely. And there are guards, Inga added. Security spirits that you don't want to meet. I'd expected all of the above, but that didn't stop me from cursing until Inga's ears blushed. What about rune magic? I asked. Can you summon enough gold to cover the fur? War guild cannot be cheated, Hearth signed. Gold must be earned or won by some great effort. That'll take years. Perhaps not, Inga murmured, as if talking to the blue rug. There is a way. Hearth turned to her. How? Inga clasped her hands in agitation. I wasn't sure if she was aware that she was making the sign for marriage. I don't mean to speak out of turn. But there is the careful one. Hearth threw his hands up in the universal gesture for "Are you kidding me?" He signed, "Careful one is a legend." No, Inga said. I know where he is. Hearth stared at her in dismay. Even if... No. Too dangerous. Everyone who tries to rob him ends up dead. Not everyone, Inga said. It would be dangerous, but you could do it, Hearth. I know you could. Hold up, I said. Who's the careful one? What are you talking about? There is a dwarf, Inga said. The only dwarf in Alfheim except for... She nodded toward our petrified friend. The careful one has a hoard of gold large enough to cover this rug. I could tell you how to find him if you don't mind a fairly high chance that you'll die. Chapter 25. Hearthstone? More like hearthrob. Am I right? You shouldn't make a comment about imminent death and then say good night. We'll talk about it tomorrow. But Inga insisted we shouldn't go after the dwarf until the morning. She pointed out that we needed rest. She brought us extra clothes, food and drink, and a couple of pillows. Then she scurried off, maybe to clean up spills or dust artifact niches or pay Mr. Alderman 5 gold for the privilege of being his servant. Hearth didn't want to talk about the killer dwarf careful one or his gold. He didn't want to be consoled about his dead mother or his living father. After a quick gloomy meal, he signed, "Need sleep," and promptly collapsed on his mattress. Just out of spite, I decided to sleep on the rug. Sure, it was creepy, but how often do you get to recline on 100% genuine peas-in-the-well fur? Hearthstone had told me that the sun never set in Alfheim. It just sort of dipped to the horizon and came back up again, like in summer in the Arctic. I'd wondered if I'd have trouble sleeping when there was no night. But I needn't have worried here in Hearthstone's windowless room. One flick of the light switch left me in total darkness. I'd had a long day, what with fighting democratic zombies and then getting dropped out of an airplane into the wealthy suburbs of elitist Heim. The evil creature's fur was surprisingly warm and comfortable. Before I knew it, I had drifted off into not-so-peaceful slumber. Seriously, I don't know if there's a Norse god of dreams, but if there is, I'm going to find his house and hack apart his sleep number mattress with a battle axe. I got treated to a flurry of disturbing images, none of which made much sense. I saw my Uncle Randolph's ship listing in the storm, heard his daughters screaming from inside the wheelhouse. Sam and Amir, who had no business being there, clung to opposite sides of the deck, trying to reach each other's hands until a wave crashed over them and swept them out to sea. The dream shifted. I saw Alex Fierro in her suite in Valhalla, throwing ceramic pots across the atrium. Loki stood in her bedroom, casually adjusting his paisley bow tie in the mirror as pots passed through him and smashed against the wall. "It's such a simple request, Alex," he said. "The alternative will be unpleasant. Do you think because you're dead you have nothing left to lose? You are very wrong. Get out!" Alex screamed. Loki turned, but he was no longer a he. The god had changed into a young woman with long red hair and dazzling eyes, an emerald green evening gown accentuating her figure. "Temper, temper, love," she purred. "Remember where you come from." The words reverberated, shaking the scene apart. I found myself in a cavern of bubbling sulfuric pools and thick stalagmites. The god Loki, wearing only a loincloth, lay lashed to 3 rock columns, his arms spread wide, his legs bound together, his ankles and wrists tied with glistening dark cords of calcified guts. Coiled around a stalactite above his head was a massive green serpent, jaws open, fangs dripping venom into the god's eyes. But instead of screaming, Loki was laughing as his face burned. "Soon enough, Magnus," he called. "Don't forget your wedding invitation." A different scene, a mountainside in Jotunheim in the middle of a blizzard. At the summit stood the god Thor, his red beard and shaggy hair flecked with ice, his eyes blazing. In his thick fur cloak, with his hide clothes dusted with snow, he looked like the abominable ginger snowman. Coming up the slope to kill him were 1,000 giants, an army of muscle-bound gargantuans in armor fashioned from slabs of stone, their spears the size of redwood trees. With his gauntlets, Thor raised his hammer, the mighty Mjolnir. Its head was a slab of iron shaped roughly like a flattened circus tent, blunt on both ends and pointed in the middle. Runic designs swirled across the metal. In the god's double-fisted grip, Mjolnir's handle looked so stubby it was almost comical, like he was a child raising a weapon much too heavy for him. The army of giants laughed and jeered. Then Thor brought down the hammer. At his feet, the side of the mountain exploded. Giants went flying in a million-ton maelstrom of rock and snow, lightning crackling through their ranks, hungry tendrils of energy burning them to ashes. The chaos subsided. Thor glowered down at the 1,000 dead enemies now littering the slopes. Then he looked directly at me. "You think I can do that with a staff, Magnus Chase?" he bellowed. "Hurry up with that hammer." Then, being Thor, he lifted his right leg and farted a thunderclap. The next morning, Hearthstone shook me awake. I felt like I'd been bench pressing Mjolnir all night, but I managed to stumble into the shower, then dress myself in elfish linen and denim. I had to roll up the sleeves and cuffs about 16 times to make them fit. I wasn't sure about leaving Blitzen behind, but Hearthstone decided that our friend would be safer here than where we were going. We set him on the mattress and tucked him in. Then the two of us crept out of the house, thankfully without encountering Mr. Alderman. Inga had agreed to meet us at the back edge of the estate. We found her waiting where the well-kept lawn met a gnarled line of trees and undergrowth. The sun was on the rise again, turning the sky blood orange. Even with my sunglasses on, my eyeballs were screaming in pain. Stupid beautiful sunrise and stupid elf world. "I don't have long," Inga fretted. "I bought a 10-minute break from the master." That made me angry all over again. I wanted to ask how much it would cost to buy 10 minutes of stomping Mr. Alderman with cleats, but I figured I shouldn't waste Inga's valuable time. She pointed to the woods. "And Very's lair is in the river. Follow the current downstream to the waterfall. He dwells in the pool at its base." "And Very?" I asked. She nodded uneasily. "That is his name, the careful one, in the old language. And this dwarf lives underwater. In the shape of a fish," said Inga. "Oh. Naturally." Hearthstone signed to Inga. "How do you know this?" Well, Master Hearthstone, Huldar still have some nature magic. We're not supposed to use it, but I sensed the dwarf the last time I was in the woods. Mr. Alderman only tolerates this patch of wilderness on his property because, you know, Huldar need a forest nearby to survive. And he can always hire more help in there." She said hire. I heard catch. The 10-minute cleat stomping session was sounding better and better. "So this dwarf," I said, "what's he doing in Alfheim? Doesn't the sunlight turn him to stone?" Inga's cowtail flicked. "According to the rumors I've heard, and Very is over 1,000 years old. He has powerful magic. The sunlight barely affects him. Also, he stays in the darkest depths of the pool. I suppose he thought Alfheim was a safe place to hide. His gold has been stolen before, by dwarves, humans, even gods. But who would look for a dwarf and his treasure here?" "Thank you, Inga," Hearth signed. The Huldar blushed. "Just be careful, Master Hearth. And Very is tricky. His treasure is sure to be hidden and protected by all sorts of enchantments. I'm sorry I can only tell you where to find him, not how to defeat him." Hearthstone gave Inga a hug. I was afraid the poor girl's bonnet might pop off like a bottle cap. Please good luck." She dashed off. I turned to Hearthstone. "Has she been in love with you since you were kids?" Hearth pointed at me, then circled his finger at the side of his head. "You're crazy." "Whatever, man," I said. "I'm just glad you didn't kiss her. She would have passed out." Hearthstone gave me an irritated grunt. "Come on. Dwarf to rob." Chapter 26. We nuke all the fish. I had trekked through the wilderness of Jotunheim. I had lived on the streets of Boston. Somehow the swath of uncultivated land behind the Alderman Manor seemed even more dangerous. Glancing behind us, I could still see the houses' towers peeking above the woods. I could hear traffic from the road. The sun shone down as glaringly cheerful as usual. But under the gnarled trees, the gloom was tenacious. The roots and rocks seemed determined to trip me. In the upper branches, birds and squirrels gave me the stink eye. It was as if this little patch of nature were trying doubly hard to stay wild in order to avoid getting turned into a tea garden. If I even see you bringing a croquet set up in here, the trees seemed to say, I will make you eat the mallets. I appreciated the attitude, but it made our stroll a little nerve-wracking. Hearthstone seemed to know where he was going. The thought of Andiron and him playing in these woods as boys gave me new respect for their courage. After picking our way through a few acres of thorn bushes, we emerged in a small clearing with a cairn of stones in the center. What is that? I asked. Hearthstone's expression was tight and painful, as if he were still forging through the briar. He signed, the well. The melancholy of the place seeped into my pores. This was the spot where his broth-er had died. Mr. Alderman must have filled in the well, or maybe he had forced Hearthstone to do it after he'd finished skinning the evil creature. The act had probably earned Hearth a couple of gold coins. I circled my fist over my chest, the sign for I'm sorry. Hearth stared at me as if the sentiment did not compute. He knelt next to the cairn and picked up a small flat stone from the top. Engraved on it in dark red was a rune, Uthala. Inheritance. The same symbol Randolph's little girl Emma had been clutching in my dream. Seeing it in real life, I felt seasick all over again. My face burned with the memory of Randolph's scar. I recalled what Loki had said in the White's tomb, blood is a powerful thing. I can always find you through him. For a second, I wondered if Loki had somehow put the rune here as a message for me, but Hearthstone didn't seem surprised to find it. I knelt next to him and signed, why is that here? Hearthstone pointed to himself. He set the stone carefully back on top of the pile. Means home, he signed. Or what is important? Inheritance. He considered for a moment, then nodded. I put it here when I left, years ago. This rune I will not use. It belongs with him. I stared at the pile of rocks. Were some of these the same ones that 8-year-old Hearthstone had been playing with when the monster attacked his brother? This place was more than a memorial for Andiron. Part of Hearthstone had died here, too. I was no magician, but it seemed wrong for a set of runestones to be missing one symbol. How could you master a language, especially the language of the universe, without all the letters? I wanted to encourage Hearth to take back the rune. Surely Andiron would want that. Hearth had a new family now. He was a great sorcerer. His cup of life had been refilled. But Hearthstone avoided my eyes. It's easy not to heed someone when you're deaf. You simply don't look at them. He rose and walked on, gesturing for me to follow. A few minutes later, we found the river. It wasn't impressive, just a swampy creek like the one that meandered through the Fenway Greenbelt. Clouds of mosquitoes hovered over marsh grass. The ground was like warm bread pudding. We followed the current downstream through thick patches of bramble and bog up to our knees. The 1,000-year-old dwarf Andvari had picked a lovely place to retire. After last night's dreams, my nerves were raw. I kept thinking about Loki bound in his cave. And his appearance in Alex Fierro's suite. It's such a simple request. If that had actually happened, what did Loki want? I remembered the assassin, the goat killer who liked to possess flight instructors. He'd told me to bring Alex to Jotunheim. She is now your only hope for success. That did not bode well. 3 days from now, the giant Thrym expected a wedding. He would want his bride, as well as a bride price of the Skofnung sword and stone. In exchange, maybe, we would get back Thor's hammer and prevent hordes of Jotunheim from invading Boston. I thought about the 1,000 giants I'd seen in my dream, marching into battle to challenge Thor. I wasn't anxious to face such a force, not without a big hammer that could explode mountains and fry invading armies into sizzly bits. I guessed what Hearth and I were doing now made sense, trudging through Alfheim, trying to retrieve gold from some old dwarf so we could get the Skofnung stone and heal Blitz. Still, I felt as if Loki was intentionally keeping us sidetracked, not giving us time to think. He was like a point guard waving his hands in our faces, distracting us from shooting for the net. There was more to this wedding deal than getting Thor's hammer back. Loki had a plan within a plan. He'd recruit my uncle Randolph for some reason. If only I could find a moment to gather my thoughts without being pulled from one life-threatening problem to another. Yeah, right. You have just described your entire life and afterlife, Magnus. I tried to tell myself everything would be fine. Unfortunately, my esophagus didn't believe me. It kept yo-yoing up and down from my chest to my teeth. The first waterfall we found was a gentle trickle over a mossy ledge. Open meadows stretched out on either bank. The water wasn't deep enough for a fish to hide in. The meadows were too flat to conceal effective traps like poison spikes, land mines, or trip wires that launched dynamite or rabid arrow dents from catapults. No self-respecting dwarf would have hidden his treasure here. We kept walking. The second waterfall had potential. The terrain was rockier, with lots of slippery moss and treacherous crevices between the boulders on either bank. The overhanging trees shaded the water and provided ample potential hiding places for crossbows or gill-laden blades. The river itself cascaded down a natural stairwell of rock before tumbling 10 feet into a pond the diameter of a trampoline. With all the churning froth and ripples, I couldn't see below the surface, but judging from the dark blue water, it must have been deep. There could be anything down there, I told Hearth. How do we do this? Hearthstone gestured toward my pendant. Be ready. Okay. I pulled off my runestone and summoned Jack. Hey, guys, he said. Whoa. We're in Alfheim. Did you bring sunglasses for me? Jack, you don't have eyes, I reminded him. Yeah, but still, I look great in sunglasses. What are we doing? I told him the basics while Hearthstone rummaged through his bag of runestones, trying to decide which flavor of magic to use on a dwarf/fish. And very. Jack said. Oh, I've heard of that guy. You can steal his gold, but don't kill him. That would be really bad luck. Meaning what, exactly? Swords could not shrug, but Jack tilted from side to side, which was his closest equivalent. I dunno what would happen. I just know it's right up there on the things you don't to-do list, along with breaking mirrors, crossing paths with Freya's cats, and trying to kiss Frigg under the mistletoe. Boy, I made that mistake once. I had the horrible feeling Jack was about to tell me the story. Then Hearthstone raised a runestone over his head. I just had time to recognize the symbol, Thurisaz, the rune of Thor. Hearthstone slammed it into the pond. Kablam. Water vapor coated my sunglasses. The atmosphere turned to pure steam and ozone so fast, my sinuses inflated like car airbags. I wiped off my lenses. Where the pond had been, a huge muddy pit went down 30 feet. At the bottom, dozens of surprised fish flailed around, their gills flapping. Whoa, I said. Where did the water fall? I looked up. The river arched over our heads like a liquid rainbow, bypassing the pond and crashing into the riverbed downstream. Hearth, how the heck? He turned to me, and I took a nervous step back. His eyes blazed with anger. His expression was scarier and even less Hearth-like than when he'd used himself into Ox Elf. Just saying, man. I raised my hands. You nuked about 50 innocent fish. One of them is a dwarf, he signed. He jumped into the pit, his boots sinking into the mud. He waded around, pulling out his feet with deep sucking noises, examining each fish. Above me, the river continued to arc through midair, roaring and glittering in the sunlight. Jack, I said, what does the Thurisaz rune do? It's the rune of Thor, Senor. Hey Thor, Senor. That rhymes. Yeah, great. But, why did the pond go boom? Why is Hearthstone acting so weird? Oh. Because Thurisaz is the rune of destructive force. Like Thor. Blowing stuff up. Also, when you invoke it, you can get a little, Thor-like. Thor-like. Just what I needed. Now I really didn't want to jump into that hole. If Hearthstone started farting like the thunder god, the air down there was going to get toxic real fast. On the other hand, I couldn't leave those fish at the mercy of an angry elf. Sure, they were just fish. But I didn't like the idea of so many dying just so we could weed out one disguised dwarf. Life was life. I guess it was a Frey thing. I also figured Hearthstone might feel bad about it once he shook off the influence of Thurisaz. Jack, stay here, I said. Keep watch. Which would be easier and cooler with sunglasses, Jack complained. I ignored him and leaped in. At least Hearth didn't try to kill me when I dropped down next to him. I looked around but saw no sign of treasure, no X's marking the spot, no trapdoors, just a bunch of gasping fish. How do we find Andvari? I signed. The other fish need water to breathe. We wait, Hearth signed. Dwarf will suffocate too unless he changes form. I didn't like that answer. I crouched and rested my hands on the mud, sending out the power of Frey through the slime and the muck. I know that sounds weird, but I figured if I could heal with a touch, intuiting everything that was wrong inside someone's body, maybe I could extend my perception a little more the same way you might squint to see farther and sense all the different life forms around me. It worked, more or less. My mind touched the cold, panicked consciousness of a trout flopping a few inches away. I located an eel that had burrowed into the mud and was seriously considering biting Hearthstone in the foot. I convinced him not to. I touched the tiny minds of guppies whose entire thought process was eek. 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 Then I sensed something different, a grouper whose thoughts were racing a little too fast, like he was calculating escape plans. I snatched him up with my Ainherji reflexes. The grouper yelled, "Gak. Andvari, I presume? Nice to meet you." "Let me go," wailed the fish. "My treasure is not in this pond. Actually, I don't have a treasure." "Forget I said that." "Hearth, how about we get out of here?" I suggested. "Let the pond fill up again." The fire suddenly went out of Hearthstone's eyes. He staggered. From above, Jack yelled, Magnus? You might want to hurry." The rune magic was fading. The arc of water started to dissolve, breaking into droplets. Keeping one hand tight on my captive grouper, I wrapped my other arm around Hearthstone's waist and leaped straight up with all my strength. "Kids, do not try this at home. I'm a trained Ainherji who died a painful death, went to Valhalla, and now spends most of his time arguing with a sword. I am a qualified professional who can jump out of 30-foot deep muddy holes. You, I hope, are not." I landed on the riverbank just as the waterfall collapsed back into the pond, granting all the little fishies a very wet miracle and a story to tell their grandchildren. The grouper tried to wriggle free. "Let me go, you scoundrel." "Counter-proposal," I said. "Andvari, this is my friend Jack, the Sword of Summer. He can cut through almost anything. He sings pop songs like a demented angel. He can also fillet a fish faster than you would believe. I'm about to ask Jack to do all of those things at once, or you can turn into your normal form, slow and easy, and we can have a chat." In 2 blinks, instead of holding a fish, my hand was wrapped around the throat of the oldest, slimiest dwarf I'd ever seen. He was so disgusting that the fact I didn't let go should have proven my bravery and gotten me into Valhalla all over again. "Congratulations," the dwarf croaked. "You got me. And now you're gonna get a tragic demise." Chapter 27. Let me go immediately, or I will make you a billionaire. Ooh, a demise. Normally I am not threatened with a demise. Most folks in the 9 worlds don't use fancy words like that. They just say I'ma kill you. Or they let their chain-mail wrapped fists do the talking. I was so impressed with Andvari's vocabulary, I squeezed his throat tighter. Ack! The dwarf thrashed and wriggled. He was slippery, but not heavy. Even by dwarf standards, the dude was tiny. He wore a fish-skin tunic and underwear that was basically a moss diaper. Slime coated his limbs. His stubby arms hammered away at me, but it didn't feel any worse than getting hit with Nerf bats. And his face, well, you know how your thumb looks after it's been under a wet bandage too long, all wrinkly and discolored and gross? Imagine that as a face, with some scraggly white whiskers and mold green eyes, and you've got Andvari. Where's the gold? I demanded. Don't make me unleash my swords playlist. Andvari writhed even more. You fools don't want my gold. Don't you know what happens to people who take it? They get rich. I guessed. No. Well, yes. But after that, they die. Or, at least they want to die. They always suffer. And so does everyone around them. He wiggled his slimy fingers like, woo, woo, threatening. Hearthstone was listing slightly to port, but he managed to stay on his feet. He signed, one person stole gold, no consequences. Then he made my least favorite name sign, index finger and thumb pinched together at the side of his head, a combination of the letter L and the sign for devil, which fit our friend Loki just fine. Loki took your gold once, I interpreted, and he didn't die or suffer. Well, yeah, but that's Loki. Andvari said. Everybody else who got the gold after him, they went crazy. They had horrible lives, left a trail of dead bodies. Is that what you want? You want to be like Fafnir? Sigurd? The Powerball lottery winners? The who? Oh, come on. You've heard the stories. Every time I lose my ring, it bounces around the 9 worlds for a while. Some schmuck gets a hold of it. They win the lottery and make millions. But they always end up broke, divorced, sick, unhappy, and or dead. Is that what you want? Hearth signed, magic ring, yes. That's the secret of his wealth. We need that. You mentioned a ring, I said. Andvari went still. Did I? Nope. Must have misspoken. No ring. Jack, I said, how do his feet look to you? Real bad, Señor. They need a pedicure. Do it. Jack flew into action. It's a rare sword that can remove caked on pond scum, shave off calluses, trim gnarly toenails, and leave a pair of dwarf feet shiny clean without 1, killing said dwarf, 2, cutting off the flailing feet of said dwarf, or 3, cutting off the legs of the Einherji who is holding said dwarf, and all the while singing Can't Feel My Face. Jack is truly special. All right. All right. Andvari shrieked. No more torture. I'll show you where the treasure is. It's right under that rock. He pointed frantically to pretty much everything until his finger came to rest at a boulder near the edge of the waterfall. Traps, Hearthstone signed. Andvari, I said, if I move that boulder, what sort of traps will I spring? None. What if I move it using your head as a lever, then? All right, it's booby-trapped. Exploding hexes. Tripwires to catapults. I knew it, I said. How do you disarm them? All of them. The dwarf squinted with concentration. At least I hoped that's what he was doing. Otherwise he was making a deposit in his moss diaper. It's done. He sighed miserably. I've disarmed all the traps. I glanced at Hearthstone. The elf stretched out his hands, probably testing our surroundings for magic the way I could sense eels and guppies. Hey, we all have different talents. Hearth nodded. Safe. With Andvari still dangling from my hand, I walked to the boulder and flipped it over with my foot. Ainherji strength is also a good talent. Under the rock, a canvas-lined pit was filled with, wow! I didn't usually care about money. I'm not about that. But my saliva glands went into overdrive when I saw the sheer volume of gold bracelets, necklaces, coins, daggers, rings, cups, monopoly tokens. I wasn't sure what the value of gold per ounce was these days, but I estimated I was looking at about $1 gajillion worth, give or take a basil lion. Jack squealed. Oh, look at those little daggers. They're adorable. Hearthstone's eyes regained their alertness. All that gold seemed to have the same effect on him as waving a cup of coffee under his nose. Too easy, he signed. Must be a catch. Andvari, I said, if your name means careful one, why are you so easy to rob? I know, he sobbed. I'm not careful. I get robbed all the time. I think the name is ironic. My mother was a cruel woman. So this hoard keeps getting stolen, but you keep getting it back? Because of that ring you mentioned. What ring? Lots of rings in that pile. Take them. No, the super magic one. Where is it? Probably in the pile somewhere. Go look. Andvari quickly pulled a ring off his finger and slipped it into his diaper. His hands were so filthy I wouldn't have noticed the ring at all if he hadn't tried to hide it. You just dropped it down your pants, I said. No, I didn't. Jack, I think this dwarf wants a full Brazilian waxing. No. Andvari wailed. All right, yes, my magic ring is in my pants. But please don't take it. Getting it back is always such a hassle. I told you, it's cursed. You don't want to end up like a lottery winner, do you? I turned to Hearth. What do you think? Tell him, Mr. Elf, said Andvari. You're obviously an elf of learning. You know your runes. I bet you know the story of Fafnir, eh? Tell your friend this ring will bring you nothing but trouble. Hearth gazed into the distance as if reading a list on some heavenly whiteboard, 10 gold for bringing home a cursed ring. Plus 10 gajillion gold for stealing a gajillion gold. He signed, ring is cursed. But also key to treasure. Without ring, treasure will never be enough. We'll always come up short. I looked at the jacuzzi-size stash of gold. I don't know, man. That seems like plenty to cover your Warguild rug. Hearth shook his head. It will not be. Ring is dangerous. But we have to take it just in case. If we don't use it, we can return it. I twisted the dwarf to face me. Sorry, Andvari. Jack laughed. Hey, that rhymes, too. What did the elf say? Andvari demanded. I can't read those gestures. He waved his grubby hands, accidentally signing Don Key Waiter Pancake in ASL. I was losing patience with the old slime bucket, but I did my best to translate Hearth's message. Andvari's moss-green eyes darkened. He bared his teeth, which looked like they hadn't been flossed since zombies inspired the Mayflower Compact. You're a fool, then, Mr. Elf, he growled. The ring will come back to me eventually. It always does. In the meantime, it will cause death and misery to whoever wears it. And don't think it will solve your problems, either. This won't be the last time you have to come home. You've only delayed a much more dangerous reckoning. The change in Andvari's tone unnerved me even more than his change from grouper to dwarf. No more wailing or crying. He spoke with cold certainty, like a hangman explaining the mechanics of a noose. Hearthstone didn't look rattled. He wore the same expression he'd had at his brother's cairn, as if he was reliving a tragedy that had happened long ago and couldn't be changed. The ring, he signed. The gesture was so obvious even Andvari understood it. Fine. The dwarf glared at me. You won't escape the curse either, human. Soon enough you'll see what comes of stolen gifts. The hairs on my arms stood up. What do you mean? He grinned evilly. Oh, nothing. Nothing at all. And very did the shimmy shake. The ring dropped out the leg hole of his diaper. One magic ring, he announced, complete with curse. There is no way, I said, that I am picking that up. Got it. Jack dove in and made like a spatula, scooping the ring out of the mud with the flat of his blade. And very watched wistfully as my sword played paddleball, flipping the ring from one side of his blade to the other. The usual deal, the dwarf asked. You spare my life and take everything I own. The usual sounds great, I said. What about all the gold in the pit? How do we carry it? And very scoffed. Amateurs. The canvas lining of the pit is a big magical sack. Pull the drawstring and voila! I have to keep the stash ready for quick getaways for those few times I avoid getting robbed. Hearthstone crouched next to the pit. Sure enough, poking from a hole in the hem of the canvas was a loop of string. Hearth pulled it and the bag snapped closed, shrinking to the size of a backpack. Hearth held it up for me to see $1 gajillion worth of gold in a super convenient carry-on size. Now honor your part of the deal. And Vari demanded. I dropped him. Humph. The old dwarf rubbed his neck. Enjoy your demise, amateurs. I hope you have pain and suffering and win 2 lotteries. With that vile curse, he jumped back into his pond and disappeared. Hey, Señor, called Jack. Heads up. Don't you dare! He flipped the ring at me. I caught it out of reflex. Ah, gross. Seeing as it was a magic ring, I half expected some big Lord of the Rings moment when it landed in my hand. Cold heavy whispering, swirling grey mist, a line of Nazgul doing the Watusi. None of that happened. The ring just sat there, looking very much like a gold ring, albeit one that had recently fallen from a 1,000-year-old dwarf's moss diaper. I slipped the ring into my pants pocket, then studied the circle of slime residue on my palm. My hand will never feel clean again. Hearthstone shouldered his expensive new backpack like gajillionaire Santa Claus. He glanced at the sun, which was already past its zenith. I hadn't realized just how long we'd been trekking through the wilds of Mr. Alderman's backyard. We should go, Hearth signed. Father will be waiting. Chapter 28. And if you order now, you also get this cursed ring. Father was waiting, all right. He paced in the living room, sipping golden juice from a silver goblet while Inga stood nearby waiting for a spill to happen. When we walked in, Mr. Alderman turned toward us, his face a mask of cold and where have you? His isosceles jaw dropped. I guess he didn't expect to see us soaked in sweat, covered in grass and twigs, our slime-caked shoes leaving slug trails across his white marble floor. Mr. Alderman's express-Zion was one of the best rewards I'd ever gotten, right up there with dying and going to Valhalla. Hearthstone plopped his canvas bag on the floor with a muffled clatter. He signed, payment palm up, brushing one finger toward his dad like he was flicking a coin at him. The way Hearth did it made it look like an insult. I liked that. Mr. Alderman forgot that he wasn't supposed to acknowledge sign language. He asked, payment? But how? Come upstairs and we'll show you. I glanced behind Alderman, where Inga stood wide-eyed, a grin slowly spreading across her face. We've got a demon skin rug to cover. Ah, the sound of golden Monopoly tokens cascading across a fur rug, there is nothing sweeter, I promise you. Hearthstone tipped over the canvas sack and walked around the rug, hosing it down with a torrent of wealth. Mr. Alderman's face got paler. In the doorway, Inga jumped up and down, clapping with excitement, heedless of the fact that she hadn't paid her master for the privilege. When the last of the gold was out, Hearthstone stepped back and threw down the empty bag. He signed, "We're guild paid." Mr. Alderman looked stunned. He did not say good job, son. Or oh, boy, I'm rich Or did you rob the elfish treasury department? He crouched and inspected the pile, coin by coin, dagger by dagger. There are miniature dogs and steam trains, he noted. Why? I coughed. I think the, previous owner liked board games. Solid gold board games. Alderman continued his inspection, making sure that the entire rug was covered. His expression turned more and more sour. Did you leave the property to acquire this? Because I did not give you permission. Nope, I said. You own the wilderness behind the backyard, right? Yes, he does. Inga said. The master glared at her, and she hastily added, because, Mr. Alderman is a very important man. Look, sir, I said, it's obvious Hearthstone succeeded. The rug is covered. Just add MIT it. I will be the judge, he snarled. This is all about responsibility, something you younger folks do not understand. You want Hearthstone to fail, don't you? Alderman scowled. I expect him to fail. There is a difference. This boy earned his punishment. I am not convinced he has the potential to pay it off. I almost screamed, Hearthstone has been paying his entire life. I wanted to pour Andvari's treasure straight down Alderman's throat and see if that convinced him of his son's potential. Hearthstone brushed his fingers against my arm. He signed, calm. Ready with the ring. I tried to control my breathing. I didn't understand how Hearth could endure his father's insults. He'd had a lot of practice, sure, but the old elf was intolerable. I was glad Jack was back in pendant form, because I would have ordered him to give Mr. Alderman the full Brazilian treatment. In the pocket of my jeans, Andvari's ring was so light I could barely feel it. I had to resist the urge to check on it every few seconds. I realized that was one reason I felt so irritated with Mr. Alderman. I wanted him to say that the debt was paid. I didn't want Hearthstone to be right about needing the ring, too. I kind of wanted to keep it. No, wait. That's not right. I wanted to return it to Andvari so we didn't have to deal with the curse. My thoughts on the subject were starting to get muddled, as though my head was full of river sludge. Aha! Mr. Alderman cried triumphantly. He pointed to the top of rug, at the nape of its neck, where the fur was thickest. A single blue hair sprouted from the treasure like a stubborn weed. Oh, come on, I said. That'll just take a minor adjustment. I shifted the treasure so the hair was covered. But as soon as I succeeded, another hair popped up from the spot where I'd taken the gold. It was like the same stupid blue hair was following me around, defying my efforts. This is no problem, I insisted. Let me get out my sword. Or, if you have a pair of scissors, the debt is not paid. Mr. Alderman insisted. Unless you can cover that last hair right now, with more gold, I am going to charge you for disappointing me and wasting my time. Say, half this treasure. Hearthstone turned to me, no surprise in his face, just glum resignation. The ring. A wave of murderous resentment washed over me. I didn't want to give up the ring. But then I looked at the whiteboards around the room, all the rules and menu items, all the expectations that Mr. Alderman expected Hearthstone not to meet. The curse of Andvari's ring was pretty strong. It whispered to me, telling me to keep it and get filthy rich. But the urge to see Hearthstone free of his father, reunited with Blitzen, and out of this toxic house, that was stronger. I brought out our secret last bit of treasure. A hungry light kindled in Mr. Alderman's space alien eyes. Very well. Place it on the pile. Father, Hearthstone signed. Warning, the ring is cursed. I will not listen to your hand gestures. You know what he's saying. I held up the ring. This thing taints whoever owns it. It'll ruin you. Heck, I've only had it for a few minutes and it's already messing with my mind. Take the gold that's already on the rug. Call the debt paid. Show some forgiveness, and we'll return this ring to its previous owner. Mr. Alderman laughed bitterly. Forgiveness? What can I buy with forgiveness? Will it bring andiron back to me? Personally, I would have punched the old dude in the face, but Hearthstone stepped toward his father. He looked genuinely worried. Curse of Fafnir, he signed. Do not. Andvari had mentioned that name. It sounded vaguely familiar, but I couldn't place it. Maybe Fafnir was a Powerball lottery winner? Hearthstone gestured please hand flat against the chest, making a circle. It struck me that please was just a more relaxed, less angry version of sorry. The two elves stared at each across the pile of gold. I could almost feel Alfheim swaying in the branches of the world tree. Despite everything Alderman had done to him, Hearthstone still wanted to help his father. He was making one last effort to pull his dad out of a hole much deeper than Andvari's. No, Mr. Alderman decided. Pay the war guild or stay in my debt, both of you. Hearthstone bowed his head in defeat. He motioned at me to give up the ring. First the Skofnung stone, I said. Let me see that you are keeping your side of the bargain. Alderman grunted. Inga, bring the Skofnung stone from its case. The security code is Greta. Hearthstone flinched. I guessed Greta was his mother's name. The Hulder scurried off. For a few tense moments, Hearthstone, Alderman, and I stood around the rug and stared at each other. No one suggested a game of Monopoly. No one yelled yippee, and jumped in the pile of gold, though I'll admit I was tempted. Finally, Inga came back, the blue-grey whetstone cupped in her hands. She offered it to Alderman with a curtsy. Alderman took it and handed it to his son. I give this to you freely, Hearthstone, to do with as you please. Let its powers be yours. He glowered at me. Now, the ring. I was out of reasons to delay, but it was still difficult. With a deep breath, I knelt and added Andvari's ring to the treasure, covering the last bit of fur. The deal is done, I said. Alderman's gaze was fixed on the treasure. Yes, except for one thing. You promised me media exposure, Magnus Chase. I have arranged a little party for tonight. Inga. The Hulder jumped. Yes, sir. Preparations are coming along. All 400 guests have RSVP'd. 400? I asked. How did you have time to set that up? How did you know we'd succeed? Ha! The crazy light in Mr. Alderman's eyes did not calm my nerves. I didn't know you'd succeed, and I didn't care. I planned on arranging parties every night while you stayed here, Magnus, preferably forever. But since you have paid the war guild so quickly, we'll have to make tonight count. As for how, I am Alderman of House Alderman. No one would dare turn down my invitation. Behind his back, Inga gave me a frantic nod and drew a line across her neck. And now? Mr. Alderman snatched the cursed ring out of the hoard. He placed it on his finger and held it out to admire it like someone newly engaged. Yes, this will look lovely with my formal attire. Hearthstone, I will expect you and your guest Hearthstone. Where are you going? Apparently Hearth had had enough of his father. With the Skofnung stone in one hand, he hauled Blitzen upright by the scarf harness and lugged him into the bathroom. A moment later, I heard the shower running. I should go help them, I said. What? Alderman snapped. Yes, fine. Such a lovely ring. Inga, make sure our young scoundrels are dressed appropriately for the party, and send some of the staff to help me with this gold. I must have every piece of treasure weighed and counted. And polished. It will look wonderful polished. And while you're at it. I didn't want to leave Inga alone in the same room with Mr. Crazy Ring, but I was getting nauseated watching Alderman flirt with his fortune. I ran to join my friends in the bathroom. The only thing more disturbing than a severed god's head in your bubble bath? A bleeding granite dwarf in your shower. Hearth propped Blitzen under the shower head. As soon as the running water cascaded over Blitz's head, his form began to soften. His cold grey face darkened into warm brown flesh. Blood flowed from his wounded gut and swirled around the drain. His knees buckled. I lurched into the stall to hold him up. Hearthstone fumbled with the Skofnung stone. He pressed it against the gushing wound and Blitz gasped. The flow of blood stopped instantly. "I'm a goner," Blitz croaked. "Don't worry about me, you crazy elf." Just he spit out water. "Why is it raining?" Hearthstone hugged him fiercely, crushing Blitz's face against his chest. "Hey!" Blitz complained. "Can't breathe here." Hearth, of course, couldn't hear him and didn't seem to care. He rocked back and forth with the dwarf in his arms. "Okay, buddy." Blitz patted him weakly. There. He looked up at me and silently asked several thousand questions with his eyes, including, "Why are the three of us taking a shower together? Why am I not dead? Why do you smell like pond scum? What is wrong with my elf?" Once we were sure he'd fully unpetrified, Hearth shut off the water. Blitzen was too weak to move, so we slid him into a sitting position right there in the shower. Inga rushed into the bathroom with a stack of towels and some fresh clothes. From Hearth's bedroom came the sound of spilling coins, like a dozen slot machines paying out, punctuated by the occasional crazy laugh. "You might want to take your time in here," Inga warned us, glancing nervously behind her. "It's a bit hectic out there." Then she left, closing the door behind her. We did our best to get ourselves cleaned up. I used an extra belt to make a strap for the Skofnung stone and tied it around my waist, tucking my shirt over it so it wouldn't be too obvious if Mr. Alderman got a case of takesy-backsies. Blitzen's wound had closed nicely, leaving just a small white scar, but he bemoaned the damage to his suit, the sword slash in the vest, the heavy bloodstains. "No amount of lemon juice will get these out," he said. "Once fabric turns to granite and back again, well, the discoloration is permanent." I didn't bother pointing out that at least he was alive. I knew he was in shock and dealing with it by concentrating on things he understood and could fix, such as his wardrobe. We sat together on the bathroom floor. Blitzen used his mending kit to stitch together bath towels for extra Alfheim sun protection, while Hearthstone and I took turns filling him in on what had been happening. Blitzen shook his head in amazement. "You did all that for me? You crazy, wonderful idiots, you could have gotten yourselves killed. And Hearth, you subjected yourself to your father? I never would have asked you to do that. You swore you'd never come back here, and for good reason." "I also swore to protect you," Hearth signed. "My fault you were stabbed. And Samaraya's." "Stop that right now," Blitz said. "It wasn't your fault or hers. You can't cheat a prophecy. That mortal wound was bound to happen, but now you've fixed it, so we can stop worrying about it. Besides, if you want to blame someone, blame that fool Randolph." He glanced at me. "No offense, kid, but I have a strong desire to murder your uncle with extreme prejudice." "No offense taken," I said. "I'm tempted to help you." And yet I remembered Randolph's horrified cry when he'd stabbed Blitzen, and the way he'd followed Loki like an abused dog. As much as I wanted to hate my uncle, I couldn't help feeling sorry for him. Now that I'd met Mr. Alderman, I was starting to realize that no matter how bad your family is, it could always be worse. Hearth finished bringing Blitzen up to speed in sign language, explaining how we'd robbed Andvari and been threatened with multiple Powerball jackpots. "You were both out of your minds to face that dwarf," Blitzen said. "He's infamous in Nidavellir, even craftier and greedier than Eitri Jr. Could we please not mention him?" I pleaded. I still had nightmares about the old dwarf who had challenged Blitz to a crafting contest last January. I never wanted to see another rocket-powered Granny Walker as long as I lived. Blitzen frowned at Hearth. "And you say your father has the ring now?" Hearthstone nodded. I tried to warn him. "Yes, but still, that thing can warp its owner's mind beyond recognition. After what happened to Hriadmar, Fafnir, Regan, and all those lottery winners, well, there's an endless list of people that ring has destroyed. Who are they? I asked. Those people you mentioned. Blitzen held up his bath towel creation, a sort of terry cloth burqa with sunglasses taped over the eyeholes. Long, tragic story, kid. Lots of death. The important thing is, we must convince Mr. Alderman to give up that ring before it's too late. We have to stay at this party of his for a while, right? That'll give us a chance. Maybe he'll be in a good mood and we can make him see sense. Hearthstone grunted. My father? Doubtful. Yeah, I said. And if he won't see sense? Then we run, Blitz said. And we hope Alderman doesn't. From the next room, Inga called, Mr. Hearthstone. Her tone verged on panic. We stumbled out of the bath and found that Hearth's bedroom had been completely stripped. The mattress was gone. The white boards had been removed, leaving bright white shadows on only slightly less white walls. The pile of treasure and the blue fur rug had vanished as if the Warguild had never happened. Inga stood in the doorway, her bonnet askew on her head. Her face was flushed, and she was anxiously pulling tufts from the end of her tail. Master Hearth, the guests have arrived. The party has started. Your father is asking for you, but... Hearthstone signed, what's wrong? Inga tried to speak. No words came out. She shrugged helplessly, as if she could not describe the horrors she had witnessed at Mr. Alderman's mix and mingle. It's probably best you see for yourself. Chapter 29. NKK. Alderman knew how to throw a party. He also knew how to throw things at a party. From the top of the staircase, we gazed down at a living room jammed with well-groomed elves in elegant white, gold, and silver outfits. Their pale eyes, fair hair, and expensive jewelry gleamed in the evening sunlight streaming through the windows. Dozens of Hulder's servants moved through the crowd, offering drinks and hors d'oeuvres. And in all the cases and niches where artifacts and minerals were once displayed, piles of Andvari's treasure glittered, making the whole room look like a jewelry warehouse after a tornado. Above the fireplace mantel, across the foot of Andiron's portrait, hung a golden banner with red letters, Welcome, Magnus Chase, son of Frey, sponsored by House Alderman. And under that in smaller print, Hearthstone has been brought back. Not returned. Been brought back. As if the elfish marshal service had apprehended him and hauled him home in chains. Alderman himself circulated through the crowd at double speed, tossing gold coins to his guests, accosting them with jewelry, and muttering, "Can you believe all this treasure? Amazing, isn't it? Would you like a golden choo-choo train? May I interest you in a dagger?" In his white tuxedo, with his wild eyes and brilliant smile, he looked like a diabolic almaitre de seating parties at Chez Mass Murder. His guests laughed nervously as he threw treasure at them. Once he passed, they muttered to one another, perhaps wondering how soon they could flee the party without seeming impolite. Alderman wove through the room, distributing golden trinkets, and the crowd moved away from him like cats avoiding an out-of-control Roomba. Behind us, Inga murmured, "Oh, dear. He's getting worse." Hearthstone signed, "The ring is affecting him." I nodded, though I wondered how strained Mr. Alderman's sanity had already been. For decades, he had been living off resentment, blaming Hearthstone for Andiron's death. Now, suddenly, Hearthstone had freed himself from that debt. Andvari's ring simply moved in to fill the void with a whole bunch of crazy. Blitzen gripped the staircase with his gloved hands. This isn't good. He was wearing his bath towel burqa to protect himself from the Alfheim light. He'd explained to us that his usual pith helmet netting and sunscreen would not be sufficient, as he was still weak from petrification. Still, the outfit was a little disturbing. He looked like a miniature version of Cousin Itt from the Addams Family. Aha! Mr. Alderman spotted us on the stairs and grinned even wider. "Behold, my son and his companions. The dwarf, at least I assume that's the dwarf under those towels." And Magnus Chase, son of Frey. The crowd turned and looked up at us, emitting a fair number of oohs and ahs. I've never liked being the center of attention. I hated it at school, and later in Valhalla. I hated even more these glamorous elves ogling me like I was a delectable chocolate fountain that had just opened for business. Yes, yes. Mr. Alderman cackled like a maniac. All this treasure you see, my friends? That is nothing compared to Magnus Chase. My son finally did something right. He brought me a child of Frey as part of his Warguild payment. And now this boy Magnus Chase will be my permanent house guest. We will start a line for photo ops at the bar. Hold up, I said. That was not the deal, Alderman. We're not staying past this party. Hearthstone signed, Father, the ring. Dangerous. Take it off. The crowd stirred restlessly, not sure what to make of this. Alderman's smile eroded. His eyes narrowed. My son is asking me to take off my new ring. He held up his hand and wiggled his finger, letting the gold band catch the light. Now, why would he ask that? And why would Magnus Chase threaten to leave, unless these scoundrels are planning to steal my treasure? Blitzen scoffed. They just brought you that treasure, you daft elf. Why would they steal it again? So you admit it. Alderman clapped his hands. All the doors to the living room slammed shut. Around the perimeter of the room, a dozen columns of water erupted from the floor and formed vaguely humanoid shapes, like balloon animals filled with water, minus the balloons. Blitzen yelped. Those are security NKKs. What? I asked. Also called nixies, he said. Water spirits. Bad news. Hearthstone caught Inga's arm. He signed, You still have family in woods? Why yes, she said. Go now, he said. I release you from my family's service. Don't come back. Also, call police. Inga looked stunned and hurt, but then she glanced at the water spirits surrounding the crowd below. She pecked Hearthstone on the cheek. I love you. She vanished in a puff of fresh laundry-scented smoke. Blitzen arched his eyebrow. Did I miss something? Hearthstone shot him an irritated look, but he didn't have time to explain. Down in the living room, an older elf shouted, Alderman, what is the meaning of this? The meaning, Lord Mayor. Alderman grinned with an intensity that was not at all sane. I now understand why you all came here. You meant to steal my treasure, but I've caught you gold-handed. Security NKKs, subdue these thieves. No one leaves here alive. Etiquette tip, if you're looking for the right time to leave a party, when the host yells, no one leaves here alive, that's your cue. Elves screamed and ran for the exits, but the glass doors were shut fast. Security nixies moved through the crowd, changing shape from animal-like to human-like to solid wave, enveloping the elves one by one and leaving them passed out on the floor in elegant wet lumps. Meanwhile, Alderman laughed and danced around the room, retrieving his gold trinkets from his fallen guests. We've got to get out of here now, Blitzen said. But we need to help the elves, I said. True, with the exception of Hearthstone, I didn't think much of the elves I'd met. I liked the guppies in Andvary's pond more. But I also couldn't stand the idea of leaving 400 people at the mercy of Mr. Alderman and his liquid nixie thugs. I pulled out my pendant and summoned Jack. Hey, guys. Jack said. What's going on, NKKs? Are you kidding me? There's nothing to cut with these guys. Just do what you can. I yelled. Too late, Hearthstone signed. Violins. I wasn't sure if I'd read that last sign correctly. Then I looked downstairs. Half the nixies had stationed themselves around the room in humanoid form and were pulling out solid violins and bows from, well, somewhere inside their liquid selves. That seemed like a very bad place to store stringed instruments, but the nixies raised the wooden violins to their watery chins. Ears. Blitz warned. I clamped my hands to the sides of my head just as the NKKS began to play. It only helped a little. The dirge was so sad and dissonant my knees wobbled. Tears welled in my eyes. All around the room, more elves collapsed in fits of weeping except Mr. Alderman, who seemed immune. He kept cackling and skipping around, occasionally kicking his VIP guests in the face. From inside his terry cloth hood, Blitzen let out a muffled yell. "Make it stop or we'll die of broken hearts in a matter of minutes." I didn't think he was being metaphoric. Thankfully, Hearthstone was not affected. He snapped his fingers for attention, then pointed at Jack, sword. "Cut violins." "You heard him," I told Jack. "No, I didn't," Jack complained. "Kill the violins." "Oh. That would be a pleasure." Jack flew into action. Meanwhile, Hearthstone fished out a rune stone. He tossed it from the top of the stairs and it exploded in midair, making a giant glowing H shape above the heads of the elves. Outside, the sky darkened. Rain hammered against the plate glass windows, drowning out the sound of the violins. "Follow me," Hearthstone ordered. He clambered down the stairs as the storm intensified. Giant hailstones slammed into the windows, cracking the glass, causing the whole house to tremble. I pressed my hand to my waist, making sure the Skofnung stone was still secure, then I ran after Hearth. Jack flew from NKK to NKK, chopping up their violins and crushing the hopes and dreams of some very talented Nixie Musikians. The water creatures lashed out at Jack. They didn't seem capable of hurting the sword any more than Jack could hurt them, but Jack kept them occupied long enough for us to reach the bottom of the stairs. Hearthstone paused and raised his arms. With a tremendous boom, every window and glass door in the house shattered. Hail swept in, pummeling the elves, Hulder, and Nixies alike. "Let's go!" I yelled to the crowd. "Come on! Fools!" Alderman cried. "You are mine! You cannot escape!" We did our best to herd everyone into the yard. Being outside felt like running through a hurricane of baseballs, but it was better than dying surrounded by NKK fiddlers. I wished I'd had the good sense to cover myself in bath towels like Blitzen. Elves scattered and fled. The Nixies rushed after us, but the hail made them sluggish, slamming into them and forming icy froth until they looked like slushies escaped from their big gulp cups. We were halfway across the lawn, heading for the wilderness, when I heard the sirens. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw emergency lights flashing as police cars and ambulances pulled into the main drive. Above us, the dark clouds began to break up. The hail subsided. I caught Hearthstone as he stumbled. I almost thought we would make it to the woods when a voice behind us shouted, "Stop!" 50 yards away, our old friends Officers Wildflower and Sunspot had drawn their firearms and were preparing to shoot us for loitering, trespassing, or running away without permission. "Jack!" I yelled. My sword rocketed toward the cops and sliced off their utility belts. Their pants promptly fell around their ankles. Elves, I discovered, should never wear shorts. They have pale gangly legs that are not at all elegant or graceful. While they tried to recover their dignity, we plunged into the woods. Hearthstone's strength was nearly gone. He leaned on me as we ran, but I'd had a lot of practice carrying him. Jack flew to my side. "That was fun," he announced. "Afraid I just slowed them down, though. I'm sensing a good place to make a cut just up ahead." "Make a cut?" I asked. "He means between worlds," Blitzen said. "I don't know about you, but to me, any of the other 8 would be preferable right about now." We staggered into the clearing where the old well had been. Hearthstone shook his head weakly. He signed with one hand, pointing in different directions. "Anywhere but here." Blitzen turned to me. "What is this place?" "It's where Hearth's brother, you know." Blitzen seemed to shrink under his mound of towels. "Oh. It's the best spot, guys," Jack insisted. There's a real thin portal between the worlds right on top of that cairn. I can behind us, a shot rang out. Everyone flinched except Hearthstone. Something buzzed past by my ear like an annoying insect. Do it, Jack! I yelled. He raced to the cairn. His blade sliced through the air, opening a rift into absolute darkness. I love darkness, Blitzen said. Come on. Together we hauled Hearthstone toward Peasenwell's old lair and jumped into the space between the worlds. Chapter 30. Somewhere over the rainbow, there's some messed up stuff going on. We tumbled down some steps to a concrete landing. The three of us lay there in a heap, gasping and stunned. We appeared to be in an emergency stairwell, exposed brick walls, industrial green handrail, fire extinguishers, and illuminated exit signs. Just above us, the nearest metal door was stenciled with the words Floor 6. I patted frantically at my waist, but the Skofnung stone was still lashed there securely, undamaged. Jack had returned to pendant form. He rested comfortably on my chain while all the energy he'd expended fighting the Nixies drained out of my soul. My bones felt leaden. My vision swam. Who knew slicing up violins and cutting the pants off police officers took so much effort? Hearthstone wasn't in much better shape. He clawed at the handrail to pull himself up, but his legs didn't seem to be working. I might have thought he was drunk, but I'd never seen him consume anything stronger than Diet Sergeant Pepper in Nidavellir. Blitzen tugged off his bath towel burqa. We're in Midgard, he announced. I'd know that smell anywhere. To me, the stairwell smelled only like wet elf, dwarf, and Magnus, but I took Blitz's word for it. Hearth stumbled, a red stain soaking his shirt. Buddy! Blitz rushed to his side. What happened? Whoa, Hearth! I made him sit down and examined the wound. Gunshot. Our friendly elfish police officers gave him a parting gift. Blitz pulled off his Frank Sinatra hat and punched right through it. Can we please go 24 hours without one of us getting mortally wounded? Relax, I said. It just grazed his ribs. Hold him steady. I signed to Hearth, not bad. I can heal. I pressed my hand to the wound. Warmth radiated through Hearthstone's side. He took a sharp inhale, then began to breathe more easily. The gouge in his skin closed up. Until I took away my hand, I didn't realize how worried I'd been. My whole body was shaking. I hadn't tried my healing powers since Blitzen had been stabbed, and I guess I was afraid they wouldn't work anymore. See? I tried for a confident smile, though it probably looked like I was having a stroke. All better. Thanks, Hearth signed. You're still weaker than I'd like, I said. We'll rest here a minute. Tonight, you'll need a good meal, lots of fluid, and sleep. Dr. Chase has spoken. Blitz scowled at the elf. And no more running into stray bullets, you hear me? The corner of Hearth's mouth twitched. I can't hear you. I am deaf. Humor, I noted. That's a good sign. We sat together and enjoyed the novelty of not being hunted, wounded, or terrified. Well, okay, I was still pretty terrified, but 1 out of 3 wasn't bad. The full suckage of our last 30-something hours in Alfheim started to sink in. I wanted to believe we'd left that crazy place behind for good. No more trigger-happy cops, manicured estates, or eye-stabbing sunlight. No more Mr. Alderman. But I couldn't forget what Aunt Very had told us. Soon I would learn the price of stolen gifts, and Hearthstone was fated to return home again. You've only delayed a much more dangerous reckoning. The Uthula runestone still sat atop the cairn where Endiron had died. I had a feeling that someday Hearthstone would have to retrieve that missing letter of his cosmic alphabet, whether he wanted to or not. I stared at Hearth as he flapped his shirt, trying to dry the blood on it. When he finally met my eyes, I signed, I'm sorry about your dad. He half nodded, half shrugged. The curse of Fafnir, I said. Can I ask? Blitzen cleared his throat. Maybe we should wait on that until he's at full strength. It's okay, Hearth signed. He leaned against the wall, steadying himself so he could use both hands for signing. Fafnir was a dwarf. And Varys' ring drove him crazy. He murdered his father, took his gold, guarded the treasure in a cave. Eventually he turned into a dragon. I swallowed. The ring can do that. Blitzen tugged at his beard. The ring brings out the worst in people, kid. Maybe Mr. Alderman doesn't have that much evil inside him. Maybe he'll just stay an unpleasant elf and win the lottery. I remembered Hearth's father cackling as he kicked his guests, dancing around as his nixies attacked the crowd. Whatever Alderman had inside him, I doubted it was a fuzzy kitten. I looked at the top of the stairwell, where a sign said roof access. We should find Sam, I said. We're supposed to talk to the god Heimdall and get directions to some place in Jotunheim, kid. Blitzen's eye twitched. I think Hearth might need a little more quiet time before we meet up with Samara and go racing off to fight giants. I could use some rest, too. Right. I felt bad bringing up our to-do list. Too many people to meet, too many dangerous worlds to visit. 3 days left to find Thor's hammer. So far we'd found a hot lady sword and a blue rock, barely managed not to get ourselves killed, and driven Hearthstone's father criminally insane. About par for the course. You want to crash at Valhalla for the night? I asked. Blitzen grunted. The Thanes don't like mortals mixing with the honored dead. You go ahead. I'll take Hearth to Nidavellir and let him rest at my place. His tanning bed is all set up. But, how will you get there? Blitz shrugged. Like I told you before, there's tons of entrances to Dwarf World underneath Midgard. Probably one in the basement of this building. If not, we'll just find the nearest sewer. Yes, Hearth signed. We love sewers. Don't you start with the sarcasm, Blitz said. Kid, how about we meet tomorrow morning at the old rendezvous point? I couldn't help but smile at the memories of the good old days, hanging out with Hearth and Blitz, wondering where our next meal would come from and when we would next get mugged. The good old days really sucked, but they'd sucked in a less complicated way than the crazy new days. The old rendezvous point it is. I hugged them both. I didn't want Hearth or Blitz to leave, but neither of them was in any shape to face more danger tonight, and I wasn't sure what I would find up on the roof. I unfastened the Skofnung stone from my belt and handed it to Blitz. Hold on to that. Keep it safe. We will, Blitz promised. And, kid, thanks. They staggered down the stairwell arm in arm, leaning on each other for support. Stop stepping on my toes, Blitz grumbled. Have you put on weight? No, lead with your left foot, you silly elf. There you go. I climbed to the top of the stairwell, wondering where in Midgard I had ended up. Annoying fact about traveling between worlds, you often pop up exactly where you need to be, whether you want to be there or not. 4 people I knew already stood on the rooftop, though I had no idea why. Sam and Amir were having a hushed argument at the base of a huge illuminated billboard. And not just any billboard, I realized. Towering above us was the famous Boston Citgo sign, a 60-foot square of LEDs that washed the rooftop in white, orange, and blue. Sitting on the edge of the roof, looking very bored, were half-born Gunderson and Alex Fierro. Sam and Amir were too busy arguing to notice me, but half-born nodded in greeting. He didn't seem surprised. I walked over to my fellow Einherjar. Sup. Alex skipped a piece of gravel across the roof. Oh, so much fun. Samara wanted to bring Amir to see the Citgo sign. Something about rainbows. She needed a male relative as a chaperone. I blinked. So you. Alex gave me an exaggerated at your Sir Vice bow. I'm her male relative. I had a moment of reality-flipping vertigo as I realized that, yes, indeed, Alex Fierro was presently a he. I'm not sure how I knew, other than the fact that he had told me so. His wardrobe wasn't gender-specific. He wore his usual rose high tops with skinny green jeans and a pink long-sleeved t-shirt. His hair, if anything, seemed a little longer, still green with black roots, now combed to one side in the shape of a wave. My pronouns are he and him, Alex confirmed. And you can stop staring. I wasn't. I caught myself. Arguing would have been pointless. Half-born, what are you doing here? The berserker grinned. He'd put on a Bruins t-shirt and jeans, maybe to blend in with the mortals, though the battle axe strapped across his back was sort of a giveaway. Oh, me? I'm chaperoning the chaperone. And my gender hasn't changed, thanks for asking. Alex smacked him, which would have made Mallory Keene proud. Ow! Half-born complained. You hit hard for an arguer. What have I told you about that term? Alex said. I will decide what is manly, unmanly, womanly or unwomanly for me. Don't make me kill you again. Half-born rolled his eyes. You killed me one time. And it wasn't even a fair fight. I got you back at lunch. Whatever. I stared at the two of them. It dawned on me that, over the last day and a half, they had become friends, in the sort of trash-talking, murdering each other way hallmates bonded on floor 19. Alex slipped his garrote from his belt loops. So, Magnus, did you manage to heal your dwarf? Yet. You heard about that. Sam filled us in. He started to make a cat's cradle with his wire, somehow managing not to cut off his own fingers in the process. I wondered if it was a good sign that Samara had shared information with Alex. Maybe they'd started to trust each other. Or maybe Sam's desperation to stop Loki had simply overridden her caution. I wanted to ask Alex about the dream I'd had of Loki in his suite, asking Alex for a simple request while Alex threw pots at him. I decided maybe this wasn't the time, especially with Fiero's garrote so close to my neck. Alex pointed with his chin to Sam and Amir. You should go on over. They've been waiting for you. The happy couple was still arguing, Sam making imploring gestures with her upraised palms, Amir tugging at his hair as if he wanted to pull his brain out. I frowned at Half-born. How could they know I would be here? I didn't even know. Odin's ravens, Half-born said, as if that was a perfectly logical explanation. By all means, go over and interrupt. They're not getting anywhere with their argument, and I'm bored. Half-born's definition of boredom was I am not killing anyone at the moment, nor am I watching someone get killed in an interesting way. Therefore, I was not anxious to alleviate it. Nevertheless, I approached Sam and Amir. Happily, Samara did not impale me with her axe. She even looked relieved to see me. Magnus, good. The light of the Sitgo sign washed over her, turning her hijab the color of tree bark. Is Blitzen okay? He's better. I told her what had happened, though she seemed distracted. Her eyes kept drifting back to Amir, who was still trying to pull out his brain. So, I wrapped up, what have you guys been up to? Amir barked a laugh. Oh, you know. The usual. The poor guy didn't sound like he was casting with a full bag of runes. I glanced at his hands to make sure he wasn't wearing a new cursed ring. Sam steepled her fingers in front of her mouth. I hoped she didn't plan on piloting airplanes today, because she looked exhausted. Magnus, Amir and I have been talking on and off since you left. I brought him here hoping to show him proof. Proof of what? I asked. Amir spread his arms. Gods, apparently. The 9 worlds. Proof that our whole life is a lie. Amir, our life isn't a lie. Sam's voice quivered. It's just, more complicated than you realized. He shook his head, his hair now sticking up like an angry rooster's comb. Sam, running restaurants is complicated. Pleasing my dad and my grandparents and your grandparents is complicated. Waiting another 2 years to marry you when all I want is to be with you, that is complicated. But this? Valkyries? Gods? Ainher, I can't even pronounce that word. Samara might have been blushing. It was hard to tell with the lights. I want to be with you, too. Her voice was quiet but filled with conviction. And I'm trying to show you. Being in the middle of their conversation, I felt about as awkward as an elf in swim trunks. I also felt guilty, because I'd encouraged Sam to be honest with Amir. I'd told her he was strong enough to handle the truth. I didn't want to be proven wrong. My instinct was to back off and leave them alone, but I got the feeling Sam and Amir were only being this open with each other because they had 3 chaperones. I will never understand these betrothed teenagers nowadays. Sam, I said, if you're just trying to show him proof of weirdness, bust out your blazing spear. Fly around the roof. You can do a million things, none of which are meant to be seen by mortals, she said bitterly. It's a paradox, Magnus. I'm not supposed to reveal my powers to a mortal, so if I try to do it on purpose, my powers won't work. I say, hey, look at me fly. And suddenly I can't fly. That doesn't make any sense, I said. Thank you, Amir agreed. Sam stomped her foot. You try it, Magnus. Show Amir you're an Ainherji. Jump to the top of the sit-go sign. I glanced up. 60 feet, tough, but doable. Yet just thinking about it made my muscles feel wobbly. My strength abandoned me. I suspected that if I tried, I'd hop 6 inches and make a fool out of myself, which would no doubt be very entertaining to Half-Born and Alex. I see your point, I admitted. But what about Hearthstone and me disappearing from the plane? I turned to Amir. You noticed that, right? Amir looked lost. I think so. Sam keeps reminding me about it, but it's getting fuzzier. Were you on that flight? Sam sighed. His mind is trying to compensate. Amir's more flexible than Barry, who forgot about you guys as soon as we landed. But still. I met Sam's eyes, and I realized why she was so worried. By explaining her life to Amir, she was doing more than just being honest. She was literally trying to reconfigure her boyfriend's mind. If she succeeded, she might open up his perception. He would see the 9 worlds as we did. If she failed, best case, Amir might eventually forget it all. His mind would gloss over everything that had happened. Worst case scenario, the experience would leave permanent scars. He might never fully recover. Either way, how could he look at Samara in the same way again? He would always have a nagging doubt that something was off, not quite right. Okay, I said, so why did you bring him here? Because, Sam started, like she'd already explained this 20 times tonight, the easiest supernatural thing for mortals to see is the Bifrost Bridge. We need to find Heimdall anyway, right? I thought if I could teach Amir to see the Bifrost, that might permanently expand his senses. The Bifrost, I said. The Rainbow Bridge to Asgard. Yes. I looked up at the Sit-Go sign, New England's largest illuminated billboard, which had been advertising gasoline over Kenmore Square for about a century. You're telling me it is the brightest stationary point in Boston, Sam said. The Rainbow Bridge doesn't always anchor here, but most of the time, guys, Amir interrupted. Really, you don't have to prove anything to me. I'll take your word for it. He let out a nervous laugh. I love you, Sam. I believe you. I may be having a nervous breakdown, but that's fine. That's fine. Let's go do something else. I understood why Amir wanted to walk away. I'd seen some crazy stuff: talking swords, knitting zombies, the world's wealthiest freshwater grouper. But even I had trouble believing that the Sit-Go sign was the gateway to Asgard. Listen, man. I grabbed his shoulders. I figured physical contact was my biggest advantage. Samara was prohibited from touching him until they were married, but there was nothing quite as convincing as shaking some sense into a friend. You have to try, okay? I know you're a Muslim and you don't believe in a bunch of gods. They're not gods, Sam volunteered. They're just powerful entities. Whatever, I said. Dude, I'm an atheist. I don't believe in anything. And yet, this stuff is real. It's some messed up stuff, but it's real. Amir bit his lip. I don't know, Magnus. This makes me very uncomfortable. I know, man. I could tell he was trying to listen, but I felt like I was yelling at him while he was wearing noise-cancelling headphones. It makes me uncomfortable, too. Some of the stuff I've learned. I stopped. I decided this wasn't the time to bring up my cousin Annabeth and the Greek gods. I didn't want to give Amir an aneurysm. Focus on me, I ordered. Look in my eyes. Can you do that? A bead of sweat trickled down the side of his face. With the effort of somebody lifting 300 pounds, he managed to meet my gaze. Okay, now listen, I said. Repeat after me, we are going to look up together. We are going to look up together. We are going to see a rainbow bridge, I said. We are going to, his voice cracked, see a rainbow bridge. And our brains will not explode. Not explode. 1, 2, 3. We looked. And crud, there it was. The perspective of the world seemed to shift, so we were looking at the sit-go sign from a 45-degree angle rather than a perpendicular one. From the top of the sign, a burning sheet of colors arced into the night sky. Amir, I said, are you seeing this? I don't believe it, he muttered, in a tone that made it clear he saw. Thank Allah, Sam said, smiling brighter than I'd ever seen, most merciful, most compassionate. Then from the heavens spoke a voice both squeaky and undivine, hey, guys. Come on up.